So what is social justice? It's important to be able to imagine what things are so that we can make them actually come to pass. And while I have a somewhat academic desire to try to define justice for you, definitions, while useful, aren't as good as imaginations in one particular way. When you can imagine something or visualize it, it's easier to build it. When you can imagine something, it's easier to gather around that particular imagination and share it with others. Imaginations are ultimately more actionable than definitions are. We don't get riled up about our definitions very often. But if we have a vision of how things can come to pass, that can move both us as persons on emotional levels and organize and structure our collective movements. And so with that in mind, I'd like to take a little time imagining justice. So take a moment and relax. And imagine a city. Build in that city buildings, some of them old, some of them new. Pave through that city roadways and build grassways and parks. Put in your mind's eye all of the structures and landscapes of a city. Then I want you to populate it with people. Have people going about their daily affairs, some of them old, some of them young, some of them busy, some of them relaxing. Imagine all of their little points of connection through this city. Now, this city doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to make it golden and sitting on the side of a hill with light coming down and radiant. It doesn't need to be carved out of alabaster or marble. It doesn't have to be a utopia. But it should be just. Imagine a just city. Now, this particular city, what sets it apart is one building. And this building is slightly raised up on a hill, such that wherever you really are in the city, you can see it and you know how to get to it. Now, when you walk up to the building, there are no locked doors. You can walk straight in any time of day or night. And in fact, the building is pretty boring, except in its center, there's a little pillar that's maybe this tall, and maybe there's a stair so that short people can step up to it. And on this pillar, there's a box, and if you pull the box back, underneath it is a button. And if anyone pushes the button, even once, the entire city is destroyed and everyone in it. So I ask you, how would that city need to be organized to prevent the pushing of that button without the use of coercion, deception, or force? What would need to be true about that city such that the button was never pushed? Now I want to deepen the question. I want you to imagine the kind of person who would desire to push the button, who would walk into that building, pull off the cap, and destroy the city and all of its residents. What is that person experiencing as they push that button? Is it scorn that drives them, or rage? Are they broken down by an incredible sense of loss or stricken by despair? Is it righteous indignation? Is it a deep sense of feeling wronged? Or is it a sense of overall wrong that they've both personally experienced and see happening over and over? So there's a lot of these reasons why someone would push the button. So pick one. Pick one of those motivations. Why? Scorn, loss, rage, despair, nihilism, indignation. And I want you to imagine what would need to have happened in that person's life to get them to that state of frustration or anger or fear. Now, imagine that you were standing in front of the building and that they are standing in front of you. And without force, coercion, or deception, how do you save your city? Now, unfortunately, not all hurts can be healed in a single conversation. So even if some people who go to the building could be talked down out of a single conversation, that city would probably not last very long, because there are some types of crises that cannot be overwhelmed by a single conversation. And so it's worth asking again, what would you need to do inside that city to solve problems before they got to the point where the person wanted to push the button? What would the conditions, the social, material, structural, economic conditions need to be the case such that the type of extreme agitation that would be required to the desire to push the button wouldn't come to pass? What types of human flourishing would need to be in place such that the button would not get pushed? Now, I have some of my own personal answers to these questions. I think that human flourishing is really important, that thinking on a long-term structural level with regard to community health is really important. But instead of wasting time filling your mind with my answers, I leave these things as questions. How would the city need to be organized to prevent the pushing of the button? What would you say to someone who wanted to push the button? And what would need to be the case such that we could solve the problems that would cause someone to push the button long before they ever came to pass? It's probably worth saying this. I am not recommending that cities have these sorts of buildings installed inside of them. I would be very anxious living in this kind of a city. But I hold it up as a thought experiment because I believe that a just city would survive far longer than an unjust one. And however outlandish, as an experiment, it helps us think about why people would want a society to stop, or why they would no longer wish to participate in it, or why they would want to retract whatever tacit investment they had in that city to the degree that they wanted it to not exist anymore. And that when you start to answer those questions, you start getting things that look a lot like justice. I would also like to propose that this may seem outlandish, but it is perhaps less outlandish than it at first sounds. There are certainly people in our society who would push this button. We have armed attacks on strangers in public places. There are people who have radical desires to watch the world come down because they no longer believe that it is structured the way that it needs to, and that the way that it is built, the nature of the status quo, is fundamentally flawed. That exists. There are people who would push that button. I also would argue that the button itself is getting more and more pushable as technology broadens its influence in our society. We become more able to do great harm to each other. The at-home 3D printing of firearms and the proliferation of various kinds of technology with regard to warfare is only growing and will continue to grow. And the idea that we can somehow hold away the mechanism of destruction from those who would desire to do the destroying is slowly becoming less and less tenable. And I do honestly believe that if we're to try to imagine what a just world looks like, that it would be one where all people would voluntarily choose to participate in that society. And that by using this as a pinprick in our mind, instead of saying, well, how would I address this or that inequity? Instead, we can say, what would cause a society to survive if there was mandated voluntary status of participation for all peoples? And that, I believe, moves us towards imagining justice.